Welcome to Undercurrents, our daily news show from Unheard's Washington Bureau. Today's guest is Jeffrey H. Anderson. Subscribe here, wherever you get your podcasts, and at undercurrents.tv for even longer versions of these interviews and the full premium experience. Debate over new statistics released by the Justice Department is raging this week. Is violent crime up or down? During the presidential debate earlier this month, David Muir attempted to correct Donald Trump's claim that crime is, quote, through the roof. Watch their exchange.
Crime is down all over the world except here. Crime here is up and through the roof. Despite their fraudulent statements that they made, crime in this country is through the roof. And we have a new form of crime. It's called migrant crime. And it's happening at levels that nobody thought possible.
President Trump, as you know, the FBI says overall violent crime is actually coming down in this country. But Vice President Harris,
the FBI they were defrauding statements. They didn't include the worst cities. They didn't include the cities with the worst crime. It was a fraud. Just like their number of 818,000 jobs that they said they created turned out to be a fraud.
So who's right? This question matters far beyond the presidential election, as struggling cities around the country wrestled with new and old methodologies of policing, education, housing, and more. Just about everyone agrees the pandemic caused a horrifying spike. But is anything working to combat it? We need to know. The man who led the Justice Department's Bureau of Justice Statistics under Trump says a BJS survey released by the Biden DOJ this week shows, quote, crime rates haven't been falling and urban crime is far worse than it was in the pre-George Floyd era. Writing in the Wall Street Journal, Jeff Anderson said the newly published National Crime Victimization Survey, or NCVS, report for 2023 finds, quote, no statistically significant evidence that violent crime or property crime is dropping in America. Excluding simple assault, the type of violent crime least likely to be charged as a felony, the violent crime rate in 2023 was 19% higher than in 2019, the last year before the Defund the Police movement swept the country. Anderson argues this rise in crime is, quote, unequal and, quote, concentrated in urban areas where leftist prosecutors have gained the strongest footholds. The results aren't pretty, said Anderson. According to the NCVS, the urban violent crime rate increased 40% from 2019 to 2023, excluding simple assault. The urban violent crime rate rose 54% over that span. From 2022 to 2023, Anderson continues, the urban violent crime rate didn't change to a statistically significant degree, so these higher crime rates appear to be the new norm in America's cities. Now here's the Associated Press comparing that same survey with FBI numbers this week, noting, quote, the victimization survey is conducted every year through interviews with about 240,000 people to determine whether they were victims of crimes. While the FBI's data only includes crimes reported to police, the victimization survey also aims to capture crimes that were not. Because it's done through interviews with victims, the victimization survey doesn't include data on murders, and it only captures crimes against people ages 12 and over. Okay, so here's also an interesting statistic. The vast majority of Americans in Gallup's annual survey said they believed crime was up over the prior year. Last fall, 77% of surveyed individuals said they believed there was more crime in general. Pew's recent analysis of the research found that, quote, in 23 of 27 Gallup surveys conducted since 1993, at least 60% of U.S. adults have said there is more crime nationally than there was the year before, despite the downward trend in crime rates during most of that period. It's so interesting. So what is the truth? Is the NCVS better than FBI numbers, or is it worse? And what on earth is actually going on? Jeffrey Anderson, the author of the aforementioned Wall Street Journal piece, is founder and president of the American Main Street Initiative. He served as the director of the Bureau of Justice Statistics, which publishes the NCVS at the U.S. Department of Justice from 2017 to 2021. Jeff joins us now. Well, Jeff, first of all, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
I want to start with a basic question, which is, what is your sense of the overall crime rate? This is the big question of the day. So as someone who studied this closely, what's your sense of what's actually happening in the U.S. right now?
Well, I think the big story with crime in the U.S. right now is that there's been a huge uptick in violent crime and property crime since 2019, the year before all the defund the police movements and George Floyd, all of that. From then until 2023, the most recent numbers we have, there's been a 40% increase in violent crime in our cities, in urban areas. I think that's the big story. And we don't see much evidence that it has subsided at this point. So it's a massive crime spike, but it's mostly been limited to our cities.
And can you talk to us a little bit about how those urban numbers are different from the rural and suburban numbers? That's also a very interesting point.
Yeah, well, we've seen a 40% spike in the urban numbers, and yet, and if you remove simple assault, which is the violent crime that's least likely to be prosecuted as a felony, then it becomes a 54% increase in violent crime. I should say this is according to the National Crime Victimization Survey, which is done by the Bureau of Justice Statistics. It's I would argue, the definitive source for crime numbers. I can get into that more. But in suburban and rural areas, the National Crime Victimization Survey, the NCVS, has found no statistically significant change in crime across the same period of time. So we see a dramatic difference between what's happening in the cities and what's happening elsewhere in the country.
Right, and let's talk then about the NCVS, because your experience is actually you've worked at the Justice Department's Bureau of Justice Statistics, and there's a lot of contrast and a lot of controversy actually over whether the media should be using FBI data or NCVS data, or what the picture looks like when we put those two data sets together. So tell us just a little bit more from your firsthand experience what the NCVS is and why you think it's a good way to measure this compared with the FBI numbers.
Sure. The NCVS is one of the largest surveys the federal government does on any topic. BJS, the Bureau of Justice Statistics, which is the statistical arm of the Department of Justice. The FBI is not the statistical arm of the Department of Justice. BJS does the survey to about nearly 250,000 Americans every year and asks whether they were a victim of violent crime. And if they say yes, then they ask more questions about the nature of the crime, who committed it, etc. It's got a number of advantages over the FBI numbers, including, perhaps most importantly, that it captures crimes that are not reported to police. The FBI is only getting data from law enforcement agencies across the country. So if crimes are not reported to police, then the FBI doesn't know about them at all. The NCVS, the victims asked by the NCVS say that most of the time, violent crimes are not reported to police. This is what the victims say. 55% of violent crimes are not reported. 70% of property crimes are not reported. So the FBI is missing a lot of data. In addition, the FBI switched its whole reporting system in 2021, going to a new system. And so it's very hard to compare pre and post 2021 in the FBI numbers. A lot of law enforcement agencies still haven't made the switch to that new system. So they're also missing a lot of agencies, like the Los Angeles Police Department, for example. So there's huge holes in the FBI data. Only 85% of law enforcement agencies are reporting. And so that's a big problem. And the FBI is not really equipped, not being a statistical agency, to try to deal with all this missing data. I think the NCVS is by far the more reliable indicator, and we see this huge urban crime spike.
Am I correct that the NCVS doesn't track murder? Is that right?
Right. It's a survey of crime victims.
Right. So you wouldn't be able to.
Were
you murdered?
Yeah. They can't use it for that.
Sure. Okay. And is the FBI data, I mean, it seems actually pretty, it seems to me this is a disservice to the country that the FBI data is missing massive urban areas where the murder rate is probably very high. How do we have a good idea of what the murder rate is? Do we have to look at cities individually? What's the best way to figure that out?
Yeah, I mean, murder more than any other crime is likely to be reported to police. And so the hard counts on murder are probably more accurate than they are on anything else. But I think at this point, you'd almost have to go and add up the results from city to city. Some police departments will count murders a little differently than others might, if you have kind of a gray area case. But that's probably the best way to do it at this point.
The other thing I wanted to ask about is how, if we are trying to put these dots together and figure out what's going on in our cities, what's your theory of the case? Why are urban areas seeing massive spikes that suburban and rural areas aren't?
I think it's rather clear. If you think about, so what happened? We had things going along basically as normal in 2019, and then you have this wild summer of 2020 with all the defund the police movements, the George Floyd killing, the riots in Minneapolis and elsewhere across America. You had a lot of people who decided that police were the enemy, claims of systemic racism. And so the move was toward more lax law enforcement, that police were under a microscope. They kind of stepped back. A lot of very left-leaning prosecutors got elected in major cities, and they chose not to prosecute so-called smaller crimes and not even necessarily aggressively prosecute a lot of larger crimes. And so as a result, you see this huge crime spike in the urban areas. I think in suburban and rural areas, it's been much more business as usual, where you haven't had this sort of takeover of law enforcement and prosecution or prosecutors' offices by the far left. It's actually very similar to, we tried this same failed experiment back in the 1960s and 70s, and we got the same result, rising crime rates. And then the solution was the so-called broken windows policing that was adopted in the 1990s and 2000s and was highly successful in bringing crime down, most spectacularly in New York City. So I think we know what works, but apparently we now have to relive some of the failed experiments of the past.
Right. In some of these cities, San Francisco, I think of London Breed kind of changing her tune. I think of Chesa Boudin actually being tossed out of office. Eric Adams coming into office after Bill de Blasio, a cop himself. It seems like some of these cities and voters in the cities realized that the experiment was failing again and brought in new leadership and tried to shift from this progressive prosecution model amid some of these obvious failures in their laboratories. So is that showing up in the data yet? What do you expect to see come out of some of these areas? Are they in too deep? Are they having a hard time righting the ship? What's going to happen going forward, even if they get rid of progressive prosecutors?
Yeah, I don't think they've gotten rid of enough of them yet or had enough of a concerted effort to adopt something more like the broken windows philosophy to see a major change. I do agree with you. I think there's been a voter backlash, and maybe that's part of why there's not much evidence that the crime spike is getting worse. We saw the huge spike from 2019 to 2022 and 2023, but it doesn't look like it's getting worse, except one exception is the NCVS shows that urban property crime actually got worse from 2022 to 2023, the most recent year we have. So, and the FBI also showed increased shoplifting. I should note that the NCVS can't capture shoplifting because it's a survey of Americans in their homes. It's not a survey of businesses. I mean, I think we're seeing a little bit of a shift away from the radical notion that we should, the whole notion of defunding police is really that's very far out there. We've seen a shift away from that, I think, but not nearly enough of one yet.
And there's something really interesting in what you're saying is that this is a city by city type of effort, because one of the points Donald Trump was making in a debate a couple of weeks ago where David Muir sort of stepped in to quote unquote correct him with the FBI numbers is this is happening under Joe Biden. Now you go back to 2019, that spike starts to happen. You were at the Trump Department of Justice and BJS under the Trump administration. But if this is driven by cities, I guess I'm curious how much you think the federal government interacts with what's happening locally, whether it's in San Francisco, New York, Chicago, or what have you.
It is city by city. The federal government certainly has a role. If nothing else, the messaging coming from the White House can have a big effect, I think. Yeah, the kind of unofficial fact checking in the debate by Muir was it was kind of amazing because he was really not right. He's looking at he's citing numbers to former President Trump that weren't even finalized, polished numbers. They were FBI numbers that were partial numbers, and again, there's a huge problem with these FBI numbers as far as the change in system in 2021, the lack of agencies reporting, the fact that even now they've got a different mix of agencies each year, because some are starting to report. And so you don't really have an apples to apples comparison. So it was a rather inappropriate fact check, I think. In addition to the fact I don't think moderators ought to play that role, period, for either candidate.
Media, I wanted to ask about in general, because the assessment, I'm curious for your assessment of media coverage of this, which heavily has favored the FBI numbers, I would argue, because they sort of confirm the bias that a lot of journalists have, that, sort of Democrats have, this sort of a right-wing lie of rising crime. I remember in the summer of 2020, when things were being burned in D.C., some people on the left here were posting pictures saying D.C. is fine, and they were at a park up in, a fancy neighborhood in Northwest. So I think there's some confirmation bias going on, but I'm curious, again, as somebody who's overseen this very research, what your 30,000-foot assessment of how the media treats these numbers, how the media reports on these numbers. What do you make of the coverage?
I agree with you completely. I think they're choosing to focus on the FBI numbers because they tell the story that they'd like to have heard, but they're ignoring the fact that the the shortcomings in those FBI numbers. And the FBI showed an increase in crime of 6%, violent crime across the country from 2019 to 2020. And then all of a sudden, when their system changed in 2021, they start showing things going the other direction. I just don't think it's a believable set of numbers. The National Crime Victimization Survey is a much more reliable gauge, and it's hard to ignore a 40% increase in urban crime from 2019 to 2023. But how often have you heard reporters cite that number? I don't know that I've ever heard somebody cite that number. But it's the big story is a huge crime boom in our cities, and it's largely been unreported.
Obviously, with broken windows theory, there's always a lot of consternation about how much the economic factors, the economic variables interact with the policing variables and the legal variables. What's your take on that? I mean, I don't mean to open up like the entire Pandora's box of rehashing broken windows theory, but just looking at the COVID economy in particular, people got checks, they got $1,000 stimulus checks, but a lot of people also found themselves suddenly out of work. How do you kind of see these variables interacting from your own vantage point?
Broken windows policing theory is relative. It's got some complexities to it. I'm not going to try to get into all the nuances of it, but I think in general, everybody wins with that philosophy, with the exception of criminals. The whole idea, as it suggests, is you go after the smaller crimes of somebody breaking a window, somebody jumping turnstiles, the kind of thing that graffiti, the kind of thing that gives the indication that your society doesn't have any order to it. And not only does it make it a more livable place when the police are helping to restore order or ensure order, but it also discourages criminals. It kind of gives the impression that you take seriously notions of crime. And today in our cities, and again, not so much in our suburbs or rural areas, but in our cities, we see these just rampant signs of disorder. The homeless encampments, the drug addicts everywhere, just the squalor of it. It's as if we're trying to look as disordered as possible almost. So I think that there's tremendous benefits from that sort of approach, but it goes very much against the far left ideology.
It's also, when I think about New York City's efforts to start cracking down, and I'm here in DC, so I'm not living this in New York myself, but there was a horrible conflict when an officer tried to crack down on turnstile jumping just I think it was a couple of weeks ago. And I forget the exact situation, but basically people got killed because the police were trying to crack down on the turnstiles. And it's such a sad state of affairs. And I wonder what your thoughts are on where we can go next if people are ending up dead just because police are enforcing basic, like you said, turnstile enforcement. So how can you even begin to tackle this issue when it also, you might have more violence in the near term?
Well, I would argue you end up with a lot more violence if you don't enforce these kinds of things. I think there's going to be unfortunate circumstances when you try to enforce the law from time to time where somebody gets hurt. But if you don't enforce the law, I think a lot more people get hurt. And you can't be discouraged too much by one particular incident, even though it had a sad result.
Do you think that Democrats are starting to come around, or do you think come around to this idea that maybe the far left was tugging them in a dangerous direction?
I think the far left is still very much, though, in control of the messaging there's not a lot of really moderate, pragmatic sort of, you don't really hear about blue dog Democrats at this point. There's a few, certainly, and I think they do realize that there's a problem here. But the edge of the rhetoric has been taken off the rhetoric, with not as much talk of defunding the police, not as much radical sort of speech. But I don't think that the underlying philosophy has changed a whole lot among progressives. But I think everyday Americans from coast to coast, and my group, the American Main Street Initiative, is a small think tank that tries to speak for or help support the efforts of everyday Americans. I think they clearly do not like seeing this crime spike. It's one of those things where I think almost all Americans can see this with their own eyes. They know what's going on. And if you actually look at the crime stats and you look at the most definitive ones, like the NCVS, you see confirmation of what Americans can see with their own eyes. You see cities out of control in terms of crime, and you see that there's not the same problem in the suburban and rural areas. I think it's one of those cases where the numbers, when read correctly, do reflect the public sentiment.
One final question, actually, now that it occurs to me, if you mapped the rise in migration on to the crime map, you see a spike in basically illegal immigration or asylum claims in the U.S. alongside the spike in crime. But I'm curious, Jeff, what your take is, because some cities like D.C., like New York, that have seen big crime spikes have also seen big spikes in migration. So is there anything connected or not?
I think it really connects back to the disorder. When you pile a bunch of people in who don't have a legal right to be in a place, and they're, especially when they're put there in large quantities, you're asking for trouble. And it is a massive influx. The Biden administration has let in enough people to populate a new Los Angeles, a new Miami, and a new Washington, D.C. in combination. We've really seen a sea change in immigration under Biden. It's really, Trump and Obama were closer on immigration than Biden has been to anybody else. And that's a whole other topic, really. But I think a lot of Americans don't realize the root cause of that is that federal law requires that if people come to the border and they're requesting amnesty, that they be detained until their amnesty case is resolved. And the Biden administration is ignoring that federal law, not enforcing that law, and just letting people into the U.S. against the law. That's what's really happening. It's not people just sort of rushing the border for the most part, although some of that happens as well. Like you said, if you have whether or not the crime rate is higher among illegal immigrants than among U.S. citizens, and nobody really definitively knows the answer to that. People can certainly hazard guesses. But if you add a bunch of people and they commit more crime and they're not supposed to be here, that's just a net loss for the American citizenry. So any crimes committed by people who aren't supposed to be here are really too many. And I think there's reason to believe that they may commit crimes at a disproportionate rate.
Jeff, thank you so much for breaking all of this down. It's such an important issue, and it seems like the statistics, at least for a lot of journalists, remain really murky. So actually getting to the bottom of it and getting the expert insight is really helpful. Thank you for your time.
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me on.
Appreciate it. Thank you so much for tuning in to today's edition of Undercurrents. I'm Emily Jashinsky. Appreciate you being here. We're here every day, so make sure to subscribe to the Undercurrents channel to get videos like this one every single day in your feed. Subscribe to the audio version wherever you download your podcasts. We're also there every single day. And if you want the full premium experience and you want to support the show, go to undercurrents.tv for even longer versions of these interviews and the full premium experience. We'll be back soon with more.